Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of the ISL Schools Talk Show. My name is Arkan De Lomas and I am a grade 12 student in ISL Qatar. This show is a collaboration between ISL London and ISL Qatar to provide a platform to share experiences and gain a deeper appreciation towards ISL's pillars: passion, diversity, understanding, and of course, identity. Our topic today is transitioning to virtual schools, and our wonderful guests are Mr. Richard Parker, ISL London's head of school, and Mr. David Monk, ISL Qatar's head of school. It's a pleasure to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arkan.
So, first of all, my strategy with my questions is that I'm going to first start off with a strategical question for you, and that is, how did your schools plan for going virtual? I'm sure that required quite a lot of strategy.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about what happened. We started planning to go virtual a few weeks before lockdown. And I think we were quite lucky because we just thought this is going to happen. So we better plan just in case. And when we started planning, it was a just in case scenario. So we want to be in a situation that if we go virtual, we're ready. And then the first thing we did is thought, okay, how are we going to look at the experience of going virtual? And the sensible thing to do seemed to be to look at schools that had had that experience. And I'm very lucky because I used to be in Hong Kong, and all the schools in Hong Kong had been in lockdown since about January. They'd been, I can't remember what time it was, but they'd already been there for 5 or 6 weeks. So what we did first of all is we just talked to all those schools and found out what had worked, what hadn't worked, what things that we should be thinking about, what we shouldn't. And from then we started drawing up some plans. And there were kind of 3 core themes that came out. The first was that you can't plan it as you would a normal school, and you really need to look at what's manageable and what's not. The second thing that became really apparent was that well-being was going to be central, and we had to have some ideas in place for how we thought about well-being for the whole community. I think for London, one of the key things that came out of that was the role of the mother tongue teachers, but also ways that we would support teachers in terms of time. We knew that they would get burnt out if we didn't introduce certain things that allowed a certain amount of time. And then the third thing was kind of technical simplicity, that schools had tried to do too much and had to pull back, and what we needed was simple and effective and everybody going the same way. So those were kind of the 3 core starting points that we had.
Yeah, very, very similar in many ways from our aspect. We had a very good idea probably about 3 weeks before the lockdown occurred in Qatar that this situation was developing and it was very likely to happen. And we also made contact with schools in China who had been through the process, and I think we're well into 5 or 6 weeks at that stage of close down. And so using and sharing resources from a number of schools, we created an initial online learning plan that we sent out to parents and to staff about 2 weeks before the lockdown actually occurred, and sought feedback and sort of made any initial changes that we felt we needed to make to that plan. We already had a number of the tools in place. Google Classroom was being used from the upper primary and throughout the secondary, managed back obviously, and Seesaw was a central platform in the primary school. So we already had the tools, if you like, to build on. And the only things that we then needed to consider was the use of video conferencing platform. And of course, we had to think about child safety issues around the use of such platforms, and so then had to develop a policy for this, making sure that that we factored in those considerations into the use of video conferencing, where you're in effect being invited into somebody's home. And often, the workspace for many kids is their bedroom. And so we really had to think through how that was going to impact our use. And then, of course, we started largely with the use of Zoom as being our main platform through the primary school, because that allowed a full class to be on screen at any one time. And then very quickly we had to change the use of that as Zoom bombing became a thing. And so we then had to move the entire platform to Teams. So we knew when we first put our plans in place that it would have to be a continually developing program, because none of us had ever been through this before. And we knew that whatever plans we put in place, we would have to review. As we did through surveying the parents, we then adapted the secondary school schedule that we were using, and really made the whole use of online learning more sustainable.
Yeah, for myself, I remember when the whole thing started happening, and teachers started reminding us, telling us that there was going to be this big change. We might end up having virtual schools. I remember one of my peers telling me that this might only last 2 weeks, and look how that turned out.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something. Both of you mentioned something about other countries and learning stuff from other countries. I'd like to hear more about that. How are our schools and international schools around the globe helping each other as we learn in this new way of living?
Well, let's take one example that actually David brought up, which was the safeguarding. We realized from talking to Hong Kong schools how many safeguarding issues there were going to be, because we could talk to different schools and they could just say, this happened and you've got to watch out for this. And so we were able to draw up a pretty good safeguarding policy before we started. And I do think one of the really nice things about being in the international world is there is a kind of that it's small enough that there's still a network. So most people who've been in international education for a period of time have people in different countries they can contact, and in a global crisis like this, there's nothing more useful, because you're not just reliant on the national response to a situation. You can go outside, you can talk to people, you can have different ideas, you can think of different ways of approaching a problem. And I do think for us, I mean, we know that when we went into it, everyone could see we were prepared. And there were lots of schools in the UK which weren't prepared at all, and just kind of had to try and work out ways to deal with the situation. And I don't think we would have been that well prepared. Well, I know we wouldn't have been that well prepared if we hadn't been able to talk to other schools around the world and look at the ways that they had come to terms with some of those problems. Because as David says, you're suddenly you're trying to run a school in a completely different way, and you have to adapt really quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say this has been one of the big pluses actually that's come out of this situation, is perhaps a level of collaboration amongst the international schools that has been huge. And a lot of that has been, I guess, brought about as well because of the different stages of the pandemic hitting different parts of the world. And as Richard referred to earlier, China obviously was one of the first areas that really was impacted, and schools were closed down very soon. And then it almost spread, and I think probably the UK was one of the later countries to actually close down. So as schools have gone through that experience, they've shared that experience with those who are about to go into it, as it were. There've been a number of platforms as well that I think have been really very significant in bringing that collaboration together. Richard, I don't know if you're making use of the AISH platform, the Association of International School Heads. being one of them. And they really have brought a huge number of resources together. There's also the Association of Advancement of International Education. And so they've been very significant platforms in collating resources from different schools and making them available to other schools to use freely. And that collaborative aspect has always been something that for me has been a wonderful part of being in international education. Often it involves traveling to conferences and things like that, where people share their ideas and things that they're using in their schools that are successful. And now it's moved on to the virtual platform. It's made it a lot easier to access.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that one of the results of this, I've always also been speaking to lots of British heads that I've never spoken to before. So I've been to a couple of online, I suppose you call them mini conferences, where suddenly I'm having conversations with 30 British heads, and people never did that before, and didn't realize how easy it was.
Yeah. I would also add to that, I mean, it's not necessarily directly through the international schools, but there's also been an explosion of access to educational thinking. A huge number of webinars. In fact, I've got two this afternoon where we're looking at the area of well-being, and if we're in this situation and it's ongoing, what are the implications of that for student well-being? And so there's a proliferation of webinars and opportunities to share ideas through virtual learning as well.
Sounds like you found a lot of new advancements or technological assets that you could use, and that's great to hear for both staff and students and even parents. But I'm speaking of staff, students, and parents. I'm sure a lot of people are curious if you've done any surveys and if there's any feedback you'd like to share from that you got from the survey that you might have given, whether it's to staff, parents, or students.
Yes, we did survey the parents initially after 4 or 5 weeks of online learning. It was important that we had feedback from them about their experience of our online learning platform. And it was we had a large number of parents who were involved, and we had lots of positive feedback, but also it was very, very clear that we were trying to do too much, and we were expecting the students to also try and do too much in really difficult circumstances, and it was almost as though we were overcompensating, I think, for the new environment that we were working within. And that led to a change, particularly in the secondary school. We'd already, I think that the schedule that we'd arrived at in the primary school was as it needed to be. But in the secondary school, we ensured that we had longer breaks between hour-long sessions. So if you like, shorter and more intense, without a doubt, periods of learning, then a break, allowing people to get up, move away from their computer, and actually have some downtime before coming back again to the screen. So it really was very, very important feedback for us. Since then we've sought feedback in different ways. We've had, particularly within the primary school, a number of virtual parent meetings where the parents have been invited to come along and again discuss and share their experiences and also learn from each other, which has been very, very useful.
Yeah, similar. We actually send out a weekly survey to parents, to students as well. They've had a whole series of surveys. We had a wellbeing survey to staff that went out a week and a half ago, and we've also had some of those online. We've had some online PTAs which they've still carried on, but in an online format, and we've got some parent conference. And probably the changes are very similar in the sense that the thing that comes up is time. we knew it would come up. And probably the single biggest change we made was that we introduced a Wednesday's elective program in primary, where there were just electives all days, basically to give everybody a break. That's probably the single biggest change that came from as a result of that feedback.
Yeah, I should also mention that we surveyed the students through the homeroom teachers as well, to get their input into the changes that we made. We also introduced within the primary school our midweek reflection day, so that allowed students to consolidate, if you like, on their learning, and to spend time with their teachers, actually going back over things that they'd been working on.
That's great to hear. Are there, and it's also very important as well, I understand that especially during this time, because of all the political things that are happening and also the health issues that are occurring, a lot of people are also very trapped in their rooms or in their houses, and that can be very stressful for a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of people will be pleased that you're actually giving them an opportunity to express themselves as frequently as possible, so that they can let out steam as much as possible, even despite the barriers of distance.
Yeah.
But are there any sort of struggles that you had with strategy and also with making these changes, or any of the struggles that you haven't mentioned so far that you'd like to mention?
Perhaps I would start here and say, from the perspective of making the shift, remarkably few. I would say the staff have been absolutely amazing across both schools. I'm sure, I don't think anybody would have been able to have predict that a change of this size and nature could have happened so quickly and so smoothly. And I think it's a credit to all of the teachers and all of the support staff as well. The amount of flexibility that they've brought to what they do on a day in, day out basis, and that rethinking of how to still achieve the goals of the school, but through a completely different platform. Difficult areas, obviously, the younger the children get, the more support they require inevitably from their parents, for example, to access the online learning programs. And I think that's been a challenge for us to ensure that we remain flexible to help each child on an individual level, not just the early childhood, but throughout the school, because each child has a different context and a different level, if you like, of support network available to them. And we are fortunate that most of our children do have good access to computers, to laptops and so on, which isn't the case throughout the world. But that's been harder for those families with younger kids, and particularly if both parents are still working. And we do still we have a number of many families where both parents are having to go out to work every day. And so that's been a difficult challenge to try and meet their needs.
Yeah, I agree with lots of that. I think, the staff at London have been absolutely amazing in the way they've adapted. And now there's a huge sense of pride across the whole school about our virtual program. It's shared by the parents, and they can see, and they've been really impressed with the staff. I do think they've just been amazing, and in ways that you wouldn't expect. I give two examples. I hate to give examples because they're specific, but they illustrate what lots of people are doing. But one of them is Mother Tongue Arabic teacher. At the end of Eid, she went round to every single family and dropped off a present for them. No one had asked her to do that, but it was just an amazing, and the Arabic parents were like, wow. And she just did it. Another example is forest school. I mean, we have forest school. You probably couldn't have forest school in Qatar. It would be really difficult. I'm not.
We might have a desert school, not a forest school.
Mangrove school.
It's hard. Yeah, it's quite, actually it's hard even in London because we got a park. But anyway, forest school is something that you would think that's really hard to keep going, but we've kept it going. And the creativity that's come about in how to keep students engaged in forest school, going out, collecting things, making things, doing things, that as well. And the one, actually there's a third example I really should give, which is the way the community reacted and the whole school reacted, which was our canteen. Now, one thing we didn't do as a school, and we're really proud we didn't do, is nobody was furloughed and nobody was made redundant. We tried to find a way that absolutely everybody had purpose in this situation. And one of the big things we did is that our school canteen staff, that's a tricky one because there's no food, right? I mean, there's no student, but what they're doing now is they're producing food for the local homeless centre, and they produce, on the days they cook, they produce 130 meals. So there's all that, and that's also helped give pride to the community. Now, all these things have come about. It's an amazing amount of creativity that people have shown and ways of adapting that have just been really, really impressive. There was a problem question, wasn't there? Yeah, younger is more difficult, no question. The younger you are, the harder it is, and the more, I would say, demands on teachers as well to come up with creative ways to deliver a really good program the younger you get, which I think, again, our staff have done as effectively as anyone could do. And there's one last thing in terms of problem. I still find it, I try and speak to as many people as I can, but the fact that you're never together as a community and you're always trying to gauge things when you see so few people except few is, I find that hard. I always feel like everybody's in a little bit of a void.
My next question was actually going to be, are there any highlights or any things that, any ways that this virtual change has allowed you to use the virtual environment as an asset to learning? But you've answered in a lot of ways. Is there anything you'd like to add on to that? Any ways that you've used the virtual environment as an asset to learning, possibly better than in face-to-face?
I think blended learning now will be a fact, not a work in progress. I think blended learning in schools has become a permanent feature now. I doubt schools will ever completely go back to a situation where learning is not blended.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, other high spots, bright spots that I see coming out of this that I think will really benefit schools as students go back to face-to-face is, I think, a real renewal, if you like, of the understanding of the importance of that social contact and that face-to-face component of teaching. And I think many teachers have really perhaps reevaluated their role as a teacher, because it really is at the heart of everything that we do. We're not teachers of a subject. We're teachers of children and young adults, and I think that will be a far stronger component of learning as a result of this. I think development of independence in learning amongst our students is something that inevitably will come from this. You know, perhaps one of the challenges that we had, particularly with those younger kids, is to encourage parents not to provide the solutions. If they're there and they're acting as the support to their children, often the first almost reflex action is to help the kids solve the problem. or even, teach them themselves. And I've had so many conversations where I said, no, that's not what we want you to do. We want you to try, absolutely give them the guidance to help them find the solutions. And even if that's directing them back to their teachers and empowering them to go back to their teachers and ask more questions, then that's been something that really has come through, I think, very, very strongly. I've had a huge number of parents, particularly from those younger kids that we talked about, who have now seen their kids working at a level of independence that they wouldn't have imagined at the start of this. These 6-year-old kids grabbing their computer, getting themselves set up for their meeting with a teacher or so on. Can I also say, from an assessment perspective, the cancelling of the IB diploma exams, and I know not everybody might agree with this, but for me, that's a huge highlight. Because if that helps the IB realize and recognize that there are other more authentic ways of assessing their students than a one-off final exam, then that could be another huge bonus that comes out of this. And already the IB are talking about the possibility of looking to continue with this model for the future. So a number of real pluses that have come out of this.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the IB, there was a time that the IB would be more adventurous than it's become in recent years. And there are a lot of heads around the world who would like it to adapt more to the reality of the times we live in. And this has forced them to rethink. We've had two major highlights in the last few weeks that are the kind of high points of the IB program. One is the PYP exhibition and the other is the personal project. Now, when we went into lockdown, I don't think anyone could quite imagine how they were going to happen, but they were both fantastic. The level of creativity that students and teachers showed in the process was phenomenal. And we've got this huge website now for the personal project where you can see all of them, and they're all grouped in a way that's really accessible and looks great. And that's examples of just the whole way that everybody so quickly adapted to new demands.
That's really an eye-opener. And not only the schools but industries are changing. They're getting to look back on how they work. Do they need to have their workers staying 9 to 5 every day, or nearly every day? Are all these things necessary? Can more be turned into virtual to allow more efficiency, effectivity, and also to benefit the workers? And so, and these changes that many industries are considering making seem to be possibly permanent. So relating to that, will this period of virtual learning change how ISL looks to deliver learning next year and beyond?
I honestly think it's too early to say.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, Richard mentioned, though, obviously blended learning model. We were making plans, of course, as all schools that are not yet reopening, to be able to deliver a model of learning that does look very different, in that it has to incorporate both virtual and face-to-face learning. We know that we will have some students that will not be able to return to school. Perhaps there are underlying health issues for the child or for family members that would make that return to school too risky. Similarly, amongst our staff, where we might have more vulnerable members of staff. Also, to be honest, the requirements of social distancing or physical distancing will mean that when we do reopen, we will have to have fewer students on campus at any single point. So we have to be able to offer something that looks very, very different. And as Richard mentioned, I'm sure that will impact education in the future. I mentioned earlier assessment as being one of the highlights, and specifically the IB diploma exams. But if we think even beyond that, the idea of assessment in a virtual environment has to look very different. And we have to reconsider the value of somebody sitting at a table with no access to resources in order to be able to answer some questions that we've thrown at them relying on memory. That's not how life works in the real world. So we've had to accept more authentic models of assessment. And I hope that that continues throughout the world of education, and I'm sure it will in both ISL schools.
And I do know that both ISL schools have actually been looking at different models of assessment, which one day we'd all like to be in a position to adopt. There are people in the world who are looking at seeing assessment in terms of ways that you can demonstrate mastery rather than doing some strange, antiquated
memory test.
Yeah.
Looking back on everything we've talked about, what has been, if you could pick one, or I guess we can allow a few more than one, but I'd like to know what are some of the biggest takeaways. I know it's still early and things are still changing, and you know, summer's coming up and things might be very different when September comes, but are there any big takeaways that you have taken, that you have learned to taken in due to this pandemic?
For me, rather than learning something new, it's actually been a confirmation of many things that I already valued and wanted to see more consideration paid towards in the world of education. And I think it's forced that reconsideration in many ways, you know, and we've touched on a number of those things already, the importance of social and emotional well-being amongst our students. It's at the center of everything that we do. And if that is not right, then effective learning cannot happen. So that has to be our starting point. In fact, our discussions for reopening were initially looking at the logistics behind what we were doing, and we had to refocus, and we came back to the question, what is it that we've been missing through virtual learning? So we have to make sure that when we open or reopen face-to-face, we're not just putting the virtual learning back into the classroom. If we're saying that what we've been missing and missing out on, if you like, it is that social contact, then we have to make sure that there's room for that. I think another big takeaway is for me is that things can happen quickly if there's the right push for it. You know, I think we achieved a level of change in 2 or 3 weeks that would normally have taken a year or 2 years.
I'd agree with everything that David said about social distancing and the difference between physical and social distancing, because one thing we've all learned from this is the social importance of schools. That it's one of the big things that you lose when everything goes virtual. The whole community aspect. And I also agree the other big thing is change. And I think the big thing that it's probably made me reflect on is the nature of change. And the thing about change is it's often perceived as hard, but actually change isn't hard. I mean, it's the thing about change is it's contextual. So if you choose to get married, for example, you don't go, oh God, I can't do that. It's a massive change, but you just go through the change. And really, it's made me reflect on the context that lead to real change and how and why they happen.
For people that I've interviewed or talked to casually, peers, and including my little brother who's in grade 8 now attending NYP, one big thing that everybody's been talking about was, like both of you mentioned, it's the social, the physical distancing. Because even though we try to keep talking to each other online, it feels different. It's almost like an uncanny valley. And so that's something that I've seen a lot of my peers miss. And it's even many of us find it as a threat to their mental health, possibly causing depression in some. At least, luckily, with my friends, we've been able to contact enough to, as far as I know, prevent it. But so that's something that my peers and I have missed a lot. I'd like to know, is there anything that both of you miss about the usual school environment that you'd like to mention? Something, maybe something that we haven't mentioned, or something that you find really important.
No, we've mentioned it, that face-to-face contact. I miss that so much. Probably the biggest aspect for me is, of course, the student contact that I have on a daily basis, and I can make sure that I maintain that. That's so much harder for me in my position now, because so much of my contact now is with the teachers and with the parents, and I really miss that contact with the students.
Thank you very much. That's all for the first episode of ISL Schools Talk Show. It's been a pleasure getting to know more about ISL's transitioning to virtual schools with Mr. Richard Parker and Mr. David Monk. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arkan. Thanks very much, Richard. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you, David.